Alrighty, so been a little inaccessible lately, in part due to just being so exhausted from work. But even getting out of work, having to scramble to take care of some other things going on. But I hopefully won't have that be a problem too much. I should be able to get some sleep this week. I'm hoping to get a lot done, so I may end up running myself ragged doing all that, but hopefully not. I have been re-examining some of my world build for my game universe, my writing and game universe. And I keep having these little momentary epiphanies that get me thinking about, like, ooh, I know what I could do that would take a total reboot of everything I've just done, but I can do some interesting things with it. So I've been kind of exploring that opportunity. In the spare moments that I've got. I'm also doing some dietary changes, so that's throwing me off a little bit. All right, so I've been reworking my storytelling and role-playing game universe, and part of that rebuild, I got to thinking, like, okay, so if I really want to do something unique and different, I'm going to have the base universe of the Empyrean Realm. I'm going to rename that because I think it has too many implications based off of other existing works. But that aside, currently it's still referring to it as the Empyrean Realm. We have Olean, which is the tar symbiote or tar parasite world. We have the Sentinels, which is the superheroes. We have Serpent's Children, which is Medusa. And theoretically, we have another one that we want to be Elvish Krypton. But we want there to be another, we were going to say, each one of these four are first mothers that contain the world within them. But we have the idea of having a fifth one that lives outside of the Empyrean Realm that is the Empyrean Realm. She contains the Empyrean Realm. So that's one of the possibilities. But outside of that fifth one, we have those four. But I've been playing around with something in my head here where we're not building a world that's based on north, south, east, west, four corners of the world kind of setting. Our setting is literally almost like a Dyson sphere. And I got to feeling like, okay, so what are the kind of foundations? We don't have a north, a south, east, and a west. We don't have that sort of four directional concept to limit us necessarily. And I got to thinking, like, what if we reworked some actual mythology? So one of the things I was looking at was the mythology of different elements. So the idea of having earth, air, fire, water, and then there's like the fifth element that is often like spirit, void, or whatever you want to call it, ether. And I got to thinking, like, what if we did this a little bit differently and looked at a couple of the different ways to list the elements? And one of the more unusual ones is a five-fold one. That's earth, metal, fire, water, wood. And I was like, that's interesting that you have wood and metal as playing components in this. But it's also interesting to note that they lack air. So here's where I was going with this. If we take air and add it to it, we have earth, air, fire, water, wood, metal. We have 6 elements. Now, I've been playing around with my conlangs a while back, where I was looking at the possibility of doing a constructed language for the gnomes and the dwarves, and I wanted them to have different bases in their mathematics. And I wanted one to have a base 6 and one to have a base 12. So if we look at things that way, and we play around with the idea of those races having been in conflict at a certain point, and sort of now they're at a truce with a Cold War going on, sort of, what you end up with is the possibility of different cultures with slightly different ways of reckoning time and direction suddenly having to share a common system. And so building around a calendar and building around a sense of direction like this, I've come up with a couple ideas that I think are interesting. But what it does is it sets up a base concept of a universe with a fascination with 6. So you have base 6 mathematics, you have the 6 elements, and I can't help but feel like if we're going to do it that way, you should have the base 6 first mothers with the unknown hidden 7th. So taking that concept, I want to carry forward the idea of the base 6 for the mothers. We already have Olean, Urt, and Sira. And we were working on, I believe, Mira and Dunia. So we could put another one in there, and that's your 6 base ones. And then the 7th one would contain the Empyrean Realm. And I want to name it, instead of the Empyrean Realm, I want to name it after the mother that it is. Because I want, if you leave the base universe and go into, say, Olean, when you get there, you're within the world inside that first mother. And as a factor of that, the people within that world will refer to their world as Olean, not considering it a goddess or an entity of some kind. That's literally just how they refer to their world. We say Earth, they say Olean. And so I want that to be, I need 7 names, 7 names for each of the first mothers. We've got 3, potentially 5, but I need 2 more at least. And then we've got an understanding of what 3 of them look like. We've got 3 more that we have to design up. And as I sort of say 2 more, because I do think we want I do think we want the elven kryptonite or krypton to be one of the factors. But I did play with the idea for a little while about the possibility of Olean being the world from which the elves came, and they were wiped out by the parasite, and it's just the last dregs of humanity trying to survive. But I feel like that's not quite right. That's not what we want to do with that, I don't think. And I do have the possibility of resorting to cast in stone, the satyrs and cyclops, and the golem based universe. But I don't. Cast in stone has a feel that's not quite right, and it would take a lot of conjiggering to get the rules of that universe to fit within the rule systems used for gameplay. It's not an impossibility, but it's more remote as a possibility. So I'm looking through some of my other story ideas for some possible approaches and trying to brainstorm what would make sense. And sometimes I'm just saying, like, okay, can we fabricate something whole cloth from new that we would fit? Like, I'm a fan of the Dinotopia series, and there's a part of me that wants to explore that opportunity, but that's something that could be a land or a part of a setting. It doesn't have to be the whole setting. I've been sort of thinking about a world in which you have vampires and werewolves, but I feel like that sort of setting, as fun as it could be, doesn't fit with some of the aspects of the greater universe. It requires some substantive changes to some of the concepts. Not that I'm opposed to changes, because I'm doing it. I'm doing changes right and left at this point. So I really have to sit here and kind of figure out some of the things I'd like to see in a setting and explore those opportunities. One of the things I have done in the meantime was I had built groupings of races for the setting into like a 4x4 chart, I think. And that 4x4 chart may still come into play based off of the ideas that races and characters have about how the universe works. And they're going to be wrong. They don't have the information right. So I kind of want to do that. I'll have to re-examine it a little bit. But the way I've actually set it up now is, instead of a 4x4, I'm doing a 6x3. So 4x4 would be 16 worlds. A 6x3 would be 18. So it's another couple of races that I have to figure out and work out. But setting them up as triplets that each descend from one of the first mothers. And I sort of set it up as dwarves, gnomes, and elves are separate origins, and humans, and I'm trying to remember. I think I set it up so that humans are humans, trolls, giants, and dwarves. I believe I went with dwarf, kobold, dragon. that's partly based off of mythology, where you have Fafnir, who was a dwarf, who's corrupted by his own ambition and greed, taking on the form of a dragon. But regardless of that, having dwarves, kobolds, dragons, having fae, and the hag race that I'm working on, and then the dryads, or nymphs in general, I guess is what I'd rather do. And so where I'm kind of going with some of this is I want a player character style race, a slightly more monstrous version of that, and then a sort of mythic elementalist version of it. So you have the dwarves, a standard player race, the kobolds, which are a monster that is oftentimes inspired by dwarves, or at least seen and treated in a way that's similar to dwarves. And then you have the dragon, which has a connection to the dwarf and the kobold, but is a mythic race that oftentimes has elemental, like it's stone skin, breathes fire, flies through the air, sort of situation. It has elemental tones to it. The elves, or fae, would be elves, or Alfar, and they're kind of dangerous, unseelie, monstrous versions of them. Not the drow. The drow are going to be part of the elvish society. And then their mythical population would be things like dryads and kelpies and things like that. Nixies, sprites, and fey creatures of the elements in the wilds. So trees and rocks and waterways. And then you have the gnomes. They are, I paired them with I forget what the monstrous version of the gnome I did was, but I guess I could do something like a red cap if I really wanted to, but gnomes, and then the mythical side of the gnomes would be, I opted for sprites or pixies, because I want to maintain that idea of them being 6 to 8 inches tall and using them that way in storytelling. And then humans are humans, trolls, and giants. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I want there to be plants and trees as separate categories. And I believe that gets us the 6 that we need. Now, one of the things I was trying to figure out is, what do you do for animals and plants that make a playable version and a monstrous version and then a mythical version? Or an elemental version. And there's groundwork for doing elemental versions. That's not super hard to pull off. You're sort of doing, like the movie Princess Mononoke uses sort of like the gods of the forest situation, and that's something you can do with a mythical creature. And you can also do things like mythical Pokemon. Meanwhile, the plants and animals on the base level, you can do most animals as a playable race if you wanted to do animal characters. I do not want to do humanoid form animals, but I have an idea for something there. Plants are a little bit harder to do something with, It's hard to do a plant that's a playable race that's not mobile. That's a really tricky thing to try to pull off, and I haven't quite cracked that one yet. But the animals that I kind of want to do, I decided not to differentiate as much between the good, like the player character, and the monstrous version of the player character. I want there to be a wolf and then a wolf. But, it's one of those sort of like a companionable wolf or a rabid monstrous wolf. But even so, the thing to keep in mind is when I've built the races in triple sets like that, triptychs, the dwarf is a playable character. The kobold is a playable character. And if you really wanted to, there's a way to play dragons as well. The issue I'm worried about is treating the monstrous version of a race as a evil version of a race. And I don't want that to be the case for the playable races of either set. But when we get to animals, that distinction is harder to make. The idea of what's the difference between a wild boar and a boar. And that's really what we're talking about. Like you're talking about barbarians is what you're looking at. The human, the troll, and the giant. The giant are a semi-civilized race of humongous beings that can tap into elemental forces of clouds and stones and whatnot. That's totally doable. The trolls are going to be the savage wild men version of trolls, and humans are going to be the semi-civilized. So you're sort of taking the barbarian version of it. And when you have something like animals, I'm not sure exactly the best way that turns out. Like, do you do like domesticated dogs as one, and then you do wild animal wolves as another, and then the mythic version is like the Mononoke wolf goddess. So it's not quite right, but that's sort of okay. And there's a part of me is that what I kind of want to do with this is there's an anime called Wolf's Rain. Now, I was thinking of this sort of popped into my head as a possibility. I was thinking of this wrong. I was thinking of this in a way it doesn't actually occur. From what I've been able to glean from trying to research it a little bit more, I've only seen bits of it and not in the proper sequence. But in Wolf's Rain, you have wolves that are thought to be extinct, living at the end of the world among humans, being able to assume the form of humans or something of that effect. And I was thinking of it more along the lines of the story was being written as if the characters were humanoid, but it's only revealed through glimpses and understandings later that they're not humanoid. They're just being relayed that way to our minds to help us empathize and see them as people. And so I kind of want to do something similar for the animals in their subset. So doing something along the lines of a people that just seem to be people, but through subtle limitations on their abilities, Like, they don't have hands, so they don't use tools the same way we would use tools. And so they're going to be more savage. When they have to manipulate things, the difficulty of manipulating things is probably going to be from the fact that they have to use their mouths like we would use our fingers. So there's a part of me that imagines working with that mindset of building that around playable animal races that are played as if human, but in the grand scheme of things, when other races interact with them, they see them and treat them as animals. I think the hardest part about that is you're designing into the storytelling or the world a population that's going to have difficulty being tool users. Not impossible, but difficulty. Like, they can shape simple tools and manipulate them with their mouths and their paws and their feet and whatnot. But there's a part of it that's a part of it that structuring the storytelling in such a way that you can have this race of non-human beings with no hands going through a fantasy setting as if they're humans. It's a weird way to play at it. And like, even harder than that is doing plants. Because plants are rooted in many cases. So having something with roots be an adventurer is a whole lot harder to do. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. And that's not a excuse not to do it. That's a challenge to myself to come up with a way to make it feasible, to explore that idea further. And so I'm hopeful I can get some of that worked out. These are some of the caveats of some of this. But one of the other things that I've really kind of enjoyed is seeing how, if we just play with things a little bit, they start to click into place in ways that I hadn't anticipated. So with the races split into sets of 3, and you get 6 of those sets, you end up with things that fit reasonably well with this mode of 3x6. Now, I have to still go back through and do the half-breeds between some of them, but they give me a little working room to do the half-breeds more intermixing. So there's room to have a elvish dragon or some such thing as that. So there's some room to play with that. And I also managed to do pairings of the classes that we usually see in role-playing games. So I took a look at what the Dungeons and Dragons class structures look like, and I set them by companionable identities. So in that case, it would be something along the lines of, the thief and bard, or rogue and bard, or fighter and paladin, or fighter and barbarian. And so basically, it's like looking at what they offer. Like, the wizard and sorcerer tend to be the magic users who study the arcane arts. The warlock and cleric tend to be the ones that seek power from a benefactor. The barbarian and the fighter tend to be the ones that use muscle, brawn, and tools to fight. The other classes that you can set up into those pairings, they work pretty well. I'm a little unsure. I'm not sure about where I want like Ranger, Paladin, Bard, and Rogue to all go together, because they can be intermixed in multiple ways. But I'm breaking them down into 6 categories. And I may introduce some new classes. Like we do have the monk in there too, the artificer, and what is it? Blood hunter or something like that, to throw in. But I may introduce a few new classes as options too, just because having that 3x6 pattern again is something I'm hopeful of carrying forward. So I'm exploring those possibilities, but seeing that setup, that something works that way, where I can have the classes, the races, the first mothers and the subworlds all meshing in with that 3 and 6 patterns. The dwarves, gnomes, and elves have a tendency to think of themselves as from 3 of the first mothers, the 3 goddesses, and humans and the other creatures as more savage beasts, and therefore they're the part of another set of 3. Whereas, in fact, there's a set of 6 that we can tend to see. And so they're looking at themselves as dwarf, gnome, elf, rather than dwarf, kobold, dragon, elf, hag, dryad, gnome. I forget what gnome's middle piece is, but pixies is their mythical version of it. And humans are just another subset where it's humans, trolls, and giants. Animals are just another set of the civilized animals and the pack animals, or the wild beasts, and then the mythical beasts. And then, not to be confused with Good Mythical Morning's fan base. And then the plants have their category. And so you have 6 categories where their vertical transition is their grouping. And then the mistaken idea that some of them have them on a horizontal pairings, and sort of uncovering that truth and that mystery. So I'm enjoying the fact that I can build through these paths, but one of the other things it lets me do is build a different kind of windrows. So some of the graphical references are going to be different than what you'd normally see in mapping. So usually in a map of nautical paths that you would see, you would have basically these little windroses with the paths for north, south, east, west, and oftentimes northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest, all marked out as these radiating rays. And these rays from different windroses, which mark different stopping locations or key locations, will intersect and form this sort of lattice, this basket weave pattern across the landscape, or the seascape as it's most often used. If you're doing that with a base 6 rather than a base 4, it changes those windroses a little bit, but it also has some implications for mapping, our tendency to use squares for mapping, because we use a north, south, east, west frame of reference. But if you're using a base 6, you can use hexagonal mapping techniques. Now, some people who play role-playing games may be familiar with hexagonal mapping for hex crawls and that kind of thing. It's a neat little tie-in, but it also ties in with a thing called the Flower of Life by modern-day mystics. It's a grid built out of triangles, and that grid is something you can build by taking basically circles. If you take a circle and you put it in the middle, and then you do 6 circles around it, where each one of them intersects with the middle of that circle and the circle next to it on either side. That pattern of intersecting circles, if you keep doing that so that each circle becomes the new center and you connect each of them to a next row out, you end up with this pattern, which is called the Flower of Life. And this pattern can be expanded indefinitely in all directions, because you're just expanding on each circle as if it's the new center. But you build this pattern of intersecting circles, and you end up with a series of overlapping lines that can be seen to form different patterns. Some of them are the lines on the diagonals. Some of them are lines that go on the verticals. And so you end up with these very kind of, you have this basically an asterisk in the middle, the 6-pointed star on your keyboard. You have this asterisk. And that asterisk has a border of the same legs that form each of the legs of the asterisk. So it's like a circled asterisk. But each one of the segments that connects 2 points of the asterisk on that circle on the outside is a leg of another asterisk. So you have the ability to build this entire chart full of asterisks. But if you take it even further, where you have these 2 interconnecting asterisks, if you really look at the connections between them, they form things that you can trace the lines of the connecting pieces, and they form these triangles that form this grid. And so building this giant triangular grid that makes this asterisk / hexagon / circle pattern, I feel like, to me, that's a far more interesting way to build maps, is doing this flower of life, circles of life pattern that has inherent in it this 3 and 6 patterning, and also sort of 12, because the asterisk has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then around the edge 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a sort of a 12-leg pattern. But this concept of like graphically, imagely, mythologically, language and culturally, genetically, you start to have this pattern working out. And it's part of the reason, like, the reason this is captured so much of my fascination, and the desire I have to make sure that each class group and each player species option fits with this 3, 6, 12 pattern, is it fits so well that, like, I can't turn my back on it now. But it also means that I got to fill in a few of those gaps that I haven't figured out just yet, and I have to build 3 more worlds, 2.5 more worlds, to make the pattern square again. Not square, hexagonal again. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those sheer joys of playing with world building when things start to gel in a certain way and you go, oh, that's too good to turn my back on now. I'm invested in this idea. Now I have to put the work in to make sure it works out right. Now, there is a little bit of something in this that gets to me a little bit, and that's if we're doing this concept of 6 first mothers, 6 directions, 6 groupings of classes, 6 race groupings, it's working really nicely. But if we throw in that hidden missing first mother, it turns into 7. Now, could I do a 7, a 7th? I have a 7th first mother. Could I do a 7th set of 3 races for her? And if I do that, I mean, she's already got her own world, which is the Empyrean realm. If we do 7 on that, do we do a 7th direction on the map? Would that be upwards or downwards or what have you? Do you do what's the secret 7th thing in everything? Do you bother building that all out, or is that something you just leave to sort of hang in the open, something unaddressed? I don't know. And it's just hanging in the back of my head and feeling like an unresolved note in a song. So I gotta sort of think about it a little bit. But yeah, so for the meantime, that's sort of what I've been working on in the background. I know I was working on, I don't even remember what story we were working on for story ideas, which I'll get back to. It's a complicated time right now. I'm not going to make too many excuses. I'll just work on it. I'll try to be better about not leaving the videos hanging when things come up. But I literally have come back each night, eaten, showered, was waiting to do a video and fell asleep on multiple occasions. So I'm going to try not to do that again for a while. Here's hoping. I'll catch you tomorrow, regardless of what the circumstances are. I will be back tomorrow. Until then, take care. Have a good night.